Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The New Media Monopoly, a completely revised and updated edition with 7 new chapters by Ben H. Begdikian, Beacon Press Books, 2004. The key idea of this text is the Big Five, being the 5 largest companies. These media companies own the lion's share of all major media types. This has taken place because of deregulation and media companies merging and buying each other up at such a fast rate. Because they don't have to deal with the complex supply chains and manufacturing lines that other types of companies have to take into consideration. Also, as time progresses, these mergers have happened on a larger and larger scale, as the Disney buy-up of Star Wars and Marvel certainly demonstrate. The Big Five are like Huxley's Brave New World. Begdikian argues that the Big Five and corporate media in general produce corporate propaganda because of their class interest as multi-billion-dollar companies. Their interest because they sell ads and products, so they avoid criticisms of the system that allows them to be multi-billion-dollar companies. For example, a news story about sweatshops in Indonesia won't get people shopping, but a story about an athlete, or the science behind the new sneaker, or something as blatant as a story about the surprising popularity of the new sneaker will surely get people hitting the stores. I'm reviewing this book because of a shocking recent commercial I saw. Let's take a look.
October 16th, 2012. Chris McHale delivers a screenplay that took 4 years of his life to Sony Pictures. After 3 months and a pile of scripts that will never be made, the screenplay is read and loved by Sony VPs.
Chris, Sony's on the phone for you.
6 months later, a Sony camera, operated by a Sony contracted director, rolls picture on the opening scene. The story spends the next 150 days on a Sony soundstage in a Sony lot, on Sony monitors, and in Sony headphones. Across town, a Sony artist sings the picture's theme at a Sony recording studio. The movie is released and played on Sony projectors. People like it a lot, including Chloe Roseman, who walks into a store 6 months later where a wall of TVs plays her new favorite film. She calmly asks, "So, which TV?"
Now let's see if this section from Begdikian's book sounds relevant. Actors and actresses in a conglomerate's wholly owned movie studio can appear on the same company's television and cable networks. Photographs of the newly minted celebrities can dominate the cover of the firm's wholly owned magazines, and those celebrities can be interviewed on the firm's wholly owned radio and television talk shows. The conglomerate can commission an author from its wholly owned book publishing firm to write a biography or purported autobiography of the new stars, which in turn is promoted on the firm's other media. What Sony is parading as positive, Begdikian warned years ago as our grim possible future. This is the fear, the warning of this text, that corporate mass domination of all media types will lead to a self-fulfilling infinite loop, absent of critical or alternative perspectives. Let's take a look at the book chapter by chapter. First, the foreword. Begdikian claims, today's modern mass media transcend global differences in language, culture, social class, and even penetrate illiteracy. A daunting image, something to keep in mind as we progress through the text. Like a large fast food chain in a third world country, the reach of corporate media and their ideology cross national borders. Begdikian concludes in the foreword with what is essentially the warning of the text. When part of the linkage between cause and effect become obscure, the sources of our weakness and of our strength become uncertain. Chapter 1. Common Media for an Uncommon Nation. Establishing the concept of the Big Five. Begdikian essentially starts the chapter defining the Big Five, stating that they own most of the newspaper, magazine, book publisher, motion picture studios, and radio and television stations in the United States. These 5 conglomerates are Time Warner, by 2003, the largest media firm in the world, Walt Disney Company, Murdoch's News Corporation, based in Australia, Viacom, and the Bertelsmann, based in Germany. This gives each of these 5 corporations and their leaders more communications power than was exerted by any despot or dictatorship in history. Begdikian wants us to understand that these Big Five are not 5 competitors, but rather 5 like-minded corporations, often working together. Like the false battles between Fox and Disney, for example, with Fantastic Four, Star Wars, X-Men, because these are franchises that both companies have used to make millions of dollars. Begdikian states, It is not necessary for a single corporation to own everything in order to have monopoly power. Technically, the dominant media firms are an oligopoly, the rule of a few in which any one of those few acting alone can alter market conditions. I liken this to how Coke and Pepsi, or Democrats and Republicans, spot the difference, bicker from time to time, but will do anything to keep an actual alternative from emerging. To demonstrate these claims, Begdikian states, 2003 Columbia Journal Review, News Corporation, Disney, Viacom, and Time Warner have 45 interlocking directors. The dominant 5 media conglomerates have a total of 141 joint ventures, which make them business partners with each other. He then lays out a history of political and media change from multiple newspapers owned by various companies and unions in every city to the oligopoly media we have now and the political implications of that with each president. Here, Begdikian demonstrates the rightward shift of media and the rightward shift of presidential politics. An example I can think of is that The Daily Show and Colbert Report may be considered left-leaning, but that's only when compared to their very conservative so-called competitors. For example, Colbert on a few occasions has criticized Apple's production practices at Foxconn in China, yet on several occasions he praises Apple's products and he frequently uses his iPad on his show. As Begdikian plainly puts it, in 1983, when the first edition of this book was published, there were 50 dominant media corporations. Today, there are 5. These 5 corporations decide what most citizens will or will not learn. He explains that it is not that major problems and events are absent, but that they're only briefly reported or reported in a certain light. Michael Prentice expressed this in an article titled "And Now for the Weather," where he says that all news is reported like the weather, day to day, rainy, sunny, not in any grand historical context. For example, in the wake of 9/11 and the subsequent several military invasions to the region, you would think that the complex history of U.S. and Middle Eastern relations dating back to the 50s would be extremely relevant. But most people don't know that history because things are never reported in their interconnected or historical context. Begdikian then goes on to explain the lavish lifestyles and profits of the corporate media types. I won't go into that here because How to Watch TV News, a review I plan to do later, goes into that a lot. So let's leave that where it is. Chapter 2, The Big Five. Now, having established the premise of the book, Begdikian looks at what makes up these companies. Begdikian starts with a look at the history, the build-up, the key players, the profits, and the ownership of the Big Five. Then Begdikian looks at what these companies own, which is kind of like looking at Procter & Gamble or Unilever. It turns out they kind of own everything. Just one example, a list of the properties controlled by AOL Time Warner takes 10 typed pages listing 292 separate companies and subsidiaries. Disney, for another example, owns Mighty Ducks, Walt Disney Pictures, Touchstone Pictures, Miramax, Buena Vista Home Video, Home Entertainment and International, Hollywood Pictures, Caravan Pictures, multiple franchises, 8 book publishers, 17 magazines, 13 radio stations, ABC TV, 11 cable channels, 13 international channels, 7 production and sports units, 17 international internet sites, which is probably a much bigger number now because every TV show and main character on the TV show has their own Twitter and Facebook account, 5 music labels, 15 theme parks, a cruise liner, over 100 retail stores, oil and gas production, and 26 joint ventures with other companies. Begdikian then looks at how this web of mass ownership has been used by companies to benefit themselves. For one example, in 1980, he, referring to Rupert Murdoch, applied for a taxpayer-subsidized loan from the Export-Import Bank in the United States. The bank staff rejected the application. Murdoch had lunch in the White House with President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and with the president of the Export-Import Bank. 2 days later, Murdoch's New York Post endorsed Carter in a bitterly fought New York presidential primary. 6 days later, the Export-Import Bank gave Murdoch his loan for $290 million for his airline, a loan underwritten by the American taxpayer for a foreign airline. Begdikian then demonstrates that not only do these companies own a law, they're also very interconnected with other companies. He states it's illegal to have directors who interlock directorates with competing firms, but most board members have such complex interrelations that the law is seldom applied. Begdikian then goes on to demonstrate that key board of directors of the Big Five are also members of companies like Xerox, Kellogg, Chevron, Dell, etc., etc., etc. Chapter 3, the Internet. This is the dated chapter. The fact that this book spends so much time talking about spam and email lets you know that this book is 10 years old. There's definitely better books or sources for specifically looking at the Internet and major media's control over it and the impact, but that's not found here. What I will say from my perspective is that I thought the way that the Internet exists today would have a similar effect to how 70s punk bands and culture led to the boom in the 80s of people saying, start a band, I could do that, start a magazine, I could do that. And so local music scenes and zines were born. In a way, this has been the case. I've seen many friends inspired by music and art that they've seen networking online, and they're inspired to create something themselves. This very YouTube channel was inspired by movie reviewers like the Nostalgia Critic or game reviewers like Super Bunny Hop giving insightful and thought-provoking content. However, when I look at the youth of today, I see a surprising wave of spectatorism, where the level of resharing and reposting has kind of pacified people, rather than the internet providing a wave of styles and music and art that would greatly differentiate people. It's created a wave of sameness, keeping up with the Joneses, rather than discovering your own niche. That, though, is a subject for other reviews and other days. I would love to see an updated version of this book, though, address advertising on websites and compiling people's information and search history for targeted ads, sponsor-generated content on BuzzFeed and College Humor. Yes, there's access to more alternative information now, but many alternative news sources still rely on mainstream sources for their information. Because who can send a reporter to Afghanistan with press credentials or get a company or government official to come in for an interview? RSA Animate had an interesting video on these concepts called The Internet in Society, Empowering or Censoring Citizens. Essentially, yes, the Internet has brought things like the Occupy movement or Ferguson to people's attention when major media tried to ignore them, but has that been for the better or worse? This book also looks at the issue of happy passive news for happy passive people, and I'd like to see an analysis of how the internet has pacified people with mindlessly scrolling through social media feeds, or the most extreme example, Let's Play videos. For the uninitiated, a Let's Play video is where someone records themselves playing a video game alongside their improvised interpretations and reactions. PewDiePie is the most famous Let's Play creator, and last I heard, the most subscribed channel on YouTube. These videos are extremely popular, and a key example of entertainment for entertainment's sake. No educational or impactful information present. South Park just did an episode all about Let's Play videos called Rehash. If you want their take on it, it's very funny. In this chapter, Begdikian also gives a fairly detailed history of copyright laws, which might sound dry and boring, but to demonstrate its importance, CGP Gray has done a brief video on copyright laws that might spike your interest. Chapter 4, Not All the News That's Fit to Print. Essentially, an updated version of Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent or Parenti's Make-Believe Media, looking at the media as media's manipulation of U.S. foreign policy. Here, Begdikian demonstrates major media being a mouthpiece of the Defense Department, talking about misinformation about Saddam, the U.S. invasion, unmentioned support of Saddam during the invasion of Iran. Books like Jeremy Slashel's Blackwater or his documentary Dirty Wars demonstrate the most extreme ways media is very controlled, locked out, and censored during modern military invasions. Begdikian gives a historical account of Spanish-American War as a classic key example of media's history of selling a war to the American people. Corporate media's desire to sell wars shouldn't be too surprising. War means U.S. domination of an area's resources, plus thousands of troops and just as many mercenaries in an area means demand for U.S. products there, thus expanding the market in that way, selling weapons, things like this. All these things benefit what John Perkins of Confessions of an Economic Hitman called the corporatocracy. Chapter 5. All the news that fits? This chapter is about justification. Begdikian outlines the premise of this chapter as follows. It's a psychological truism that if a powerful individual commits a crime or acts contrary to common ethical behavior, one reaction is to rationalize the act as necessary and justified. The individual assumes that since the act was necessary and therefore good, reasonable people will agree. If some do not, they are either ignorant and can be ignored or hostile and be considered an enemy. To support this analysis, Begdikian states, the United States, the world's only superpower, has fewer correspondents permanently stationed in foreign capitals than any other major Western nation. Like the NoFX lyric, outside of California, it's foreign policy. The text then does a short list of various popular left and communist governments that were overthrown by the U.S., but more or less left completely out of the media. Chile, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Colombia, East Timor, etc., etc. Detailed accounts of these events can be found in Stephen Kinzer's Overthrow or William Bloom's Killing Hope, but here Begdikian gives us a shorter, more media-centered account, which is very important. Begdikian goes on to claim that in the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States used lies as weapons. Their intelligence agencies created the now standard euphemism disinformation. But a democracy cannot lie to another nation without telling that lie to its own people. Democracies aren't supposed to lie to their citizens. The statement isn't supposed to be a shame on the U.S. or even a yes but. He's not highlighting this as an exception to the rule. Instead, he's naming culpability, that states do lie to their people and the media follow suit. Begdikian goes on to claim, control of public information by a handful of powerful global firms weakens democracy by omission of news that might interfere with the media's maximizing their own profits. One of the great thinkers, either Freire or Chomsky, couldn't find the direct quote, made a similar analysis of public education, explaining that the powers that be don't need to control and monitor education. They just simply don't allow an education system that directly challenges their power. Like the media's manipulation and omission of U.S. foreign policy, Begdikian criticizes the media's rightward drift on social services such as HUD, FDC, welfare. Essentially, that the U.S. media has led a war on poverty. Welfare queen myth, contract on America, no more handouts, no more illegal aliens, plastered across the TV as the human suffering that comes with the loss of services, adequate food, shelter, job opportunities, was absent from the media. I always hear news stories about the immigration problem, but I notice they're always referring to people coming in and never refer to the massive amounts of businesses and jobs leaving. Michael Prentice argued similarly, referring to Martin Luther King's famous phrase, the rich are heartlessly indifferent to the poor. Prentice corrects this statement, claiming that as a social class, the rich have an active vested interest in keeping people poor and maintaining that status. There are good books about social services and their impact, but the lens of media representation that Begdikian gives here to the subject is very important. Chapter 6, Paper in the Digital Age, Newspaper in the Modern Age and the Physical Existence of News. Begdikian addresses the physical way media exists, stating literally 99.9% of contemporary daily papers are a monopoly in their own cities. That's a sharp contrast with the newspaper scene in other industrialized countries. In London, for example, there are 12 daily papers. In Paris, 33. In Tokyo, 31. A friend once told me that in countries they visited, there were different papers known as the conservative paper or the communist paper. However, in the U.S., the focus on being non-biased leads all papers to come out just right of center. Begdikian also looks at TV news' ability to play only one story at a time, thus limiting knowledge. I'm not going into this kind of thing too much because How to Watch TV again touches on this, and I'll save that for that review. Chapter 7, Rebellion and Remedies. How did things get this way and how do we fix them? Here, Begdikian gives a history of laws being written or rewritten to allow corporate control of the media to take place. For example, corporate media leaders heading the government agencies that are supposed to regulate them, and laws about who and how to run the public airways. Begdikian criticizes this shift, stating, when some of the most pressing domestic problems and a fair spectrum of ideas and commentary have disappeared from the main media, the American public has lost its real choices. Begdikian then lays out solutions for the Big Five, such as antitrust laws, and he describes beacons of hope in our society like media watchdog groups and consumer and youth activist groups. Chapter 8, Won't They Ever Learn? This is about what motivated the policies that allowed the Big Five to happen. Begdikian goes into a little of the history with figures such as Ralph Nader and other types in the late 70s that made industry realize it better get involved in the media and change its tune. Begdikian gives a striking demonstration of this, stating that corporations, they're not only hostile to independent journalists, they are their employers. Begdikian then quotes Arthur Temple, a vice chairman of Temple Estates, the largest stockholder of Time Inc., the largest magazine publisher in the country, who said, "What our country needs worse than anything is freedom from the press. The press is absolutely intolerable today." Chapter 9, From Mythology to Theology. This chapter is the history of big media stomping out smaller media. How ad revenue beat out subscription revenue, thus getting rid of media reporters who displeased big business. For example, unions used to own radio stations, playhouses, newspapers, etc., but those have all about essentially vanished from public viewership. Chapter 10, Dear Mr. President. This chapter claims that because media portrays politics, media controls politics. Begdikian talks about corporate media lobbying, the huge umbrella corporations with control over a variety of media can use one medium they control to enhance another. The example he gives is that Time Inc., if they want to influence a politician, they can publish that politician's books, turn around and praise those books in their magazine and their book club. Chapter 11, Only the Affluent Need Apply. This chapter looks at the often miscritique that media and advertisers want affluent viewership, and so they're biased against the wants and aspirations and needs of those less fortunate. An easy example is that the stock market ticker is always going across the bottom of the news screen, but information that's useful for people in, say, minimum wage jobs are not used because it's not good for business. It's not good for advertisers. Those viewers in the corporate media's eyes don't matter. Some aspects of this chapter are dated still, but important to analyze. For example, he talks about viewers being categorized by demographics like age, income, and gender in ways that weren't used before. Although this is old news, an analysis of this fact is important now that social media sites and search engines categorize and collect people's information for targeted ads. I'd like to see an updated edition address YouTube, Hulu, and Netflix having programs supported and sponsored by only one company. Politically, I'm split on this. On the one hand, a show or YouTube channel supported by a clothing company might be more able to critique the pharmaceutical industry, where a cable network couldn't do it because clothing and pharmaceutical commercials are playing on their network. But on the negative side, I don't really think that a strong critique could be reached because sponsored content will never critique the system as a whole. Chapter 12, Dr. Brandreth has gone to Harvard. Media Ideology. Begdikian starts this chapter with explaining, if the audiences were told that the ideas represented explicit demands of corporations who advertised, the messages would lose their impact. For more on this analysis, last week tonight's John Oliver did a great clip on native advertising, which gives this concept a modern analysis. Begdikian then looks at corporate media's ideological lens with some striking examples. Procter & Gamble's actual media policy states, in dealing with war, our writers should minimize the horror aspect. The writers should be guided by the fact that any scene that contributes negatively to public morale is not acceptable. There will be no material on any of our programs which could in any way further the contempt of business as cold, ruthless, and lacking all sentiment or spiritual motivation, etc., etc., etc. Talk about manufacturing consent. Begdikian then uses examples and statistics of media changing their story, dropping stories, or inventing stories to please advertisers. I'm reminded of a news channel discussion I saw discussing the Postal Service, and an anchor claimed something to the effect of, as a general rule, I always consider privatization as the best option. Often when I'm watching corporate news, a segment here or there, a story about Black Friday deals or the surprising popularity of a new book or movie, etc., will make me think, this isn't news. What am I watching this commercial for? And now many articles on the internet are directly sponsor produced. So this is the obvious evolution of this sickness in the media. To finish my analysis, I want to explain how this text changed how I think. Looking back now, his predictions are very telling. It's important to keep in mind the audience content is looking for, and so the ideological lens that exists, but also ideologically who is producing the content and the lens that creates. This book reminds me to take advantage of the many media sources we have available. The Stimulator, if you wanted some more anarchist type news. Jason Ureth, if you wanted a communist news. Adam Kokesh and his Freedom for some anarcho-cap type news. RSA Anime for lectures and animated lectures. CGP Grey. The Young Turks. Various other media that could never be portrayed on corporate media in the same way. Key message of this book is that it's very important, which is very important at this time, is when movies, TV, and video game producers are picking up franchises left and right, the media monopoly grows. This book has reminded me to always keep in mind when I'm reading or watching or listening, who owns this message? What's their ideological lens or bias? This book also reminds me that when I wonder about something not being reported on, or why this story is always being reported in this light, it's because large corporate media firms with like-minded corporate ideologies, they dominate the media narrative. So if you're interested in how the media got to be this way, why it functions how it does, I recommend this book. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.